Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. We've got an interesting one teed up for you guys here. It's called Feeding Management of Heifers, and that's with Dr. Gail Carpenter from Iowa State University. Gail, welcome. This is the first time to your pub. Always like to see new faces here.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, super. What I'd like you to do is just kind of give everybody some background on who Gail is.
That's a very broad question.
It is a broad question.
So I'm currently the state dairy specialist at Iowa State University. So I'm a 60% extension appointment, and then I have a 20% research appointment, and technically it's 15% teaching, 5% service, but I just tell people I'm 60-20-20. So I get to work with our Iowa dairy producers, I get to do a little bit of research, and I get to coach our Dairy Challenge team.
Oh,
so,
sounds like a lot of fun. I think I've seen you at the Dairy Challenge before.
Maybe, probably.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yep. The gentleman here to your left is Dr. Barry Bradford, Michigan State University. Got a Spartan in the house.
Go green.
Yeah.
Go white.
So Barry, give us just a little background. You probably don't need any introduction, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I've been back at Michigan State for about 5 years now after spending 13 years at Kansas State, where I got to ride the coattails of Gail Carpenter while she did a whole bunch of work that I slapped my name on. So, half research, half extension position at MSU now.
Yeah, super. Great to have you here. And here to my right, got a couple Buckeyes, OH. Bill, why don't we start with you? Just real quick. I know you don't need an introduction, but tell the audience who you are.
I was a professor at OSU, or the OSU, for about 35 years in dairy nutrition, retired a few years ago, and learning how to be more retired than I am now.
Yeah,
so.
I know. It's kind of hard, right, to keep getting pulled back into this, don't you? Yeah. Alex, not your first trip to the pub. Welcome back. I think the last time was Bill, we were in Canada, and we did a podcast. We got talking about poor Bill stuck in Newark, New Jersey. And I'm like, we got to go get Bill. And we did.
I still appreciate that very much. So.
Anyway, Alex, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you doing these days?
Yeah, so I work for Purina Animal Nutrition. I do technical services and consulting on dairies throughout Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky.
Wow, that's a big territory.
Yeah.
Good. Good for you.
Yeah, I'm a former grad student of Dr. Weiss himself, his last one that finally kicked him over the edge.
Yeah.
You got to end on a high note.
Yeah.
Well, welcome. Glad to have you back, Alex.
Thanks.
So, Gail, tell us a little bit about the presentation.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about basically distilling some of the work we've been doing, educating our dairy producers about raising heifers. So we got some funding a couple of years ago from Extension Risk Management to talk about heifer development and do some work with our producers on heifer development around the state. And that involved going out to dairies and helping them benchmark their heifer growth and development, as well as doing some live sessions and doing some outreach and education too. So taking some of that messaging that we did as part of that project and distilling it down into some of the key points that we've been trying to lead our dairy producers to, looking at optimizing heifer development, starting with reducing morbidity and mortality, and then getting them bred in a timely way so that we are keeping a tight age at first calving, regardless of what we think an optimum age at first calving is. So I don't think we're going to see anything particularly earth-shattering in my presentation, but the fact that we kind of keep having to have some of these conversations shows that they're still important.
Okay. So tell me about the research and what did you find out?
So this was not actually a research project.
Okay.
It was an extension project.
Okay, got
So we mostly worked with pretty small herds. And I at one point had thought maybe we'll get a critical mass and we'll be able to do some cool.
Define small.
I think our smallest farm was probably 50 cows.
Got it.
But we had a couple hundred cow dairies,
Yeah.
right? And so they tended to be on the smaller side. And I think one of the things that we found, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is mostly anecdotal, right? In conversations that we had to have with producers. And one of the messages that we kind of kept coming back to was making sure that you're prioritizing heat detection and conception in these heifers. Heifers tend to be, they're down the road, they're around the corner, may not necessarily be, you're milking your cows twice a day. You probably have maybe activity monitors. Even if you don't, you're at least having those multiple touch points with your lactating cows throughout the day. And they're the ones that are actually paying the bills right now, right? Whereas heifers are going to pay the bills in a few years, or in a couple years. And so those lactating cows really tend to be top of mind. And especially if you're a small farm that maybe you're working a lot as a family producer, might not have all the employees, heifers make their way to the bottom of the list. And so getting semen into those heifers in a timely way, making sure that we're investing in heat detection, whether that's using cedar sink protocol or whether that's actually, monitoring heifers for heat, sticking to the protocols that we have really helps to bring down that variation in age at first.
So what are the gaps besides breeding? That was like a big one you pointed to.
Yeah, that's I think a low-hanging fruit on several of the farms that we worked with. Also, things that we can talk about is just general record keeping. That tends to be another thing that maybe doesn't make its way to the top of the list. And one of the things we talk about when I'm presenting this to producers is when I have a New Year's resolution, I try not to do this anymore, but New Year, you set a New Year's resolution. And once you set one, you're going to set I'm going to be a completely changed, different person by the end of the year. I'm going to be so much because I'm going to run 3 miles every day and I'm going to read a book every week and all these things that are going to, make me better. And then you get 2 weeks in and you're like, well, I'm not doing any of that. And then you kind of give up, right? So if we think of record keeping as kind of like that New Year's resolution, starting small, starting with something that's manageable for you, and starting with something that is specific enough and detailed enough that you or your consultant can take advantage of some of that data collection, but not so detailed or so broad or so involved that you're just not going to do it. It's better to do something at a manageable level and actually accomplish it than to go way overboard and not be able to keep up with it.
Yeah, do you see some of these gaps a little more prevalent on some of these smaller dairies as opposed to larger dairies?
I think that, I don't know if anybody's exempt from this, right?
Yeah, got it.
And I, have dealt with a couple dairies. It's like, oh yeah, we write that down and it's in a desk drawer somewhere, right? And so I always encourage those producers to hey, why don't we talk to some of your consultants or your extension specialists and see if we can help you get that put in. And I always say, your nutritionist would really love this information, right? You're collecting it, and let's just make sure that it can get into the hands of somebody who can use it. So.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So what's the most, if you could only do one record, what's the most important for heifers?
Birth date, death date. Hopefully not death date, but obviously our big dates need to be taken care of. I would really like to see calving ease included. I love the idea of a calf birth certificate. You may have seen those. It's a little one-sheeter, and that travels with the calf as she goes through that pre-weaning phase, and writing down things like vaccinations, date of dehorning, any treatments that she needed, birth weight, weaning weight. I know you said 1, and I gave you 10. But in addition to all of the dates, I think the things that are really important is that initial birth weight, that weaning weight, if we can get it, and any treatment records that we have. So And there's ways that we can do that to kind of incorporate it into our existing routines. And that whole idea, especially with individually housed calves, if you have, especially if they're indoors too, the little clipboard that goes on the front of that calf's pen can be just a really helpful, easy way to accomplish that.
Yeah. Alex, you're belly to belly with a lot of dairymen out there. Is any of this ringing true?
Yeah, I would agree completely, especially with the value of today's heifers and guys wanting to run lower cull rates and tighter heifer numbers. It's really important that we really hone in on the heifers that we're producing that are going to enter in the herd if we are putting such a value on our heifer population. So I think those are important things that we need to be looking at constantly, and it starts with, as Gail mentioned, good records.
Yeah. And you find that a gap, not having a lot of good records out there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It can be a challenge.
I think a lot of times when we're talking about heifer economics and reducing how much or optimizing how much we spend on our heifers, we tend to focus on that age at first calving a lot of times, right? Like if we can lower that age at first calving to from 24 to 23, like how much we save per heifer. And we forget, first of all, that's an investment potentially, but also there's so many other places along the way where we need to focus too. So if you're making a bunch of calves that don't even make it to first breeding, that aren't getting bred or that aren't calving in, if you're having a lot of heifer morbidity in that pre-calving phase, those are all the low-hanging fruit that we can really focus on to make sure we're making quality heifers.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about measuring and tracking health events? Because I know that health events when they're calves will translate a lot of times into performance as an adult animal. Talk a little bit about that.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, we actually did a study. This isn't in replacement heifers. This was a study we did in beef on dairy calves. I had a master student who graduated last summer. She did the pre-weaning phase, and we finally have the finishing data on all of these steers that we ran through. And we did some nutritional things pre-calving. We gave them 2 different levels of starch in their starter, and then post-calving they went on 2 different diets. So we had like a 2x2 there with different nutritional interventions. And we found some neat stuff, but what we found was health actually had a very large impact too. So any calf that had 2 or more, or any steer who had 2 or more respiratory events, they had a lower carcass weight and a lower return on investment. So we've seen, and there's data out there on BRD, on these respiratory events, or if they're starting off on the wrong foot, that has a real economic impact.
Yeah, especially if it damages the lungs. Would you say respiratory is more important than maybe gastrointestinal issues?
Well, dehydration is obviously going to be a big problem for calves, right? If we have dehydrated calves, that's going to be a big killer of calves too. So if we're looking at gastrointestinal, you have that risk of dehydration, right? And so we want to make sure that we're monitoring that. But a lot of the data on the long-term impacts does come from that respiratory pneumonia.
I want to give Barry, you got an opportunity to get in here.
I'm curious, Gail, have you seen people implementing the lung ultrasounding in the process? Obviously, you have to make more heifers if you want to give yourself room to remove some, but do you see people implementing that?
We don't have that's a great question. We don't have a ton of producers that are doing that. I'm curious if you're seeing a lot of that. It does tend to be some of our larger farms that do kind of lean onto the lung ultrasound thing. I think there's a ton of potential to it for some of those subclinical events that we don't even know that we're having.
Right.
But are you seeing a lot of farms that are...
It really varies. I think it's been used as a tool, as like a benchmarking system that different farms have had versus a troubleshooting thing, kind of like benchmarking your growth throughout the different stages that we'll go in and check some lung scores and see how we're doing, and monitoring that throughout the year isn't as popular as, okay, here's where we're at, here's how we compare to some other farms. Do we have a problem?
Title is Feeding Management. Talk to me about that. What kind of things you're going to share during the presentation?
Well, the title that I ended up being, I kind of lightninged out from that, which probably isn't too surprising. But feeding management, we're going to talk some pretty basic basic concepts there, not making sure your heifers aren't over-conditioned, and making sure you're getting good growth out of them. In that, there's so many different ways to manage heifers well and so many different ways to make mistakes. But I think a lot of that comes down to, are we managing the body condition and are we managing their growth at the same time, and kind of finding those two things in balance. So you'll hear about precision feeding. We used to call it limit feeding, but that's not the kosher term to use anymore. So precision feeding these dairy heifers and maybe not feeding them to ad lib versus potentially using some higher forage diets and just feeding that bulky diet that's going to fill them up while not over conditioning them or giving them too many calories there. So we're going to talk about some generally some concepts around feeding management with that, and then also the importance of mature body weight and understanding what your mature body weight is of your herd, which is something that we, as part of our extension outreach, we're helping producers measure on their own and find that for their herd.
How common is precision feeding now to heifers?
I'm not seeing it very much, at least not where we are.
Yeah, I see it very rarely
Yeah.
anymore. I mean, the management side of it is so much more difficult than it is in a conventional, and things coming around more so like double cropping, where we have an abundant amount of forage that we can feed those animals. You just don't see it as much anymore, at least in the Midwest.
Yeah. And I'm going to talk a little bit about using alternative forages too. And sometimes when you're doing, like you said, double cropping, cover crops, like a lot of times we'll get a lot of biomass on forages that aren't super high quality. And so potentially, that might be an opportunity to feed it to heifers, assuming that we're not, loading them up with mycotoxins that could potentially hurt reproduction. Kind of getting some of those bulky forages into heifer diets can be a really good solution.
Is the goal still 22 to 24 months, or has that changed?
It really depends on who you talk to. I think.
Okay, well, talk to you.
It depends, right? We're an extension. We say it depends. So that 22 to 24 months, I think, is still a good goal for a lot of farms. But really what's more important is not the age itself, but the body weight, right? So 22 months can be too young for some herds if you're not getting good growth and they're not hitting that target percent mature body weight at calving. That can be too young. Alternatively, 24 months might be too old for some herds. It really depends on your heifer management and when you're hitting those growth targets.
For someone who doesn't know much about heifers, what's the percent of mature
weight
that?
Thank you. 75 to 80% would be the one that's typically thrown around there. Yep.
I've seen herds that were averaging under 21 months.
Yes.
And that bothered me. Like, they didn't have any body weight data, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't optimal. Do you agree?
Probably.
Yeah.
I think, at least, and I haven't been around I haven't been around as long as. I'm trying to say this without saying some people are old. In my time, it seems like there's been, we saw a lot, like, 5-10 years ago about, age at first calving is way too old. We need to lower that. And we have a tendency to think, okay, if this is too old and a little bit younger is better, then much younger must be even better, right? And so we kind of keep pulling. I think we see that in a lot of things, not just heifers, but we tend to, inflammation's a good example of that. Well, if some inflammation is bad, then maybe we want to eliminate it, right? And usually that's not the solution. Usually it's somewhere in the middle ground there. And so I think that it does seem like for a while there was this push just younger, because, okay, every day you're not spending feeding that heifer and she's not milking, you're saving that money, but it is an investment, right? So that is the foundation of your herd. You want to make sure she's successful, and it doesn't really make sense to breed her and she calves in at 21 months, but then you cull her for low milk production when she just didn't have the opportunity to be able to perform, right? So it is finding that middle ground, and I think at a certain point you're just not going to have like physiological maturity too, right? So.
Right, and she's going to have to catch up anyway, so she's going to expend those or take those groceries in anyway.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Gil, I had a question for you. One of the questions I get oftentimes on some of these farms is, do we bring back the heifers home and homegrown heifers, or do we move to a custom raiser? Any kind of questions that you feel would be important when you're deciding to do custom or a homegrown heifer, and what resources are out there to make that decision?
Penn State actually has a lot of great resources on custom rearing dairy heifers. I hate to kick it outside of our our own home court, but they do that. But the Penn State Extension website has a lot of great resources on that, and we actually in our own extension programming we rely on some of the work that they've done there quite a bit. But I think, so one of the things to consider is, do you have the space and the resources, and be reasonable and honest with yourself, right? Kind of like the goal setting and the New Year's resolutions. You want to make sure that you're being honest with yourself about what your capacity is, right? And making sure that your facilities are appropriate size for the number of heifers that you have. Grazing heifers can be a fantastic option. Grazing heifers can be a great way to get good growth out of heifers. But grazing is not the same as throwing them out on the dry lot and expecting them to do okay, right? Like, grazing done well is actually very intentional. And so I bring that up as an example of thinking like, okay, maybe we can expand our facility. Not expand our facility, but we can expand the number of heifers we have by grazing some of them and keeping them at home. But really, you need to be sure that you have the capacity to be able to graze right. So a good starting question is going to be looking at your own resources and your own capacity, whether that's facilities or labor, and looking at that in balance with the number of heifers you have. But working with custom heifer growers, making sure those animals are getting bred at the right size. Size and age is important in breeding, and keeping an eye on those numbers, those conception rates, and looking at those heifers when they're coming back, and making sure that you're still having that your grower is still meeting the expectations that you have. And like so many things in this life, a lot of that comes back to good communication and making sure that we're having open and honest conversations.
I understand, taking a look at your own operation, but perfect world. Do you think people ought to be raising their own heifers? I kind of think back, never raised any heifers myself, but my kids, I'd rather raise my kids than somebody else raise my kids, right? And so it just seems natural to me that nobody's going to do it the way I'm going to do it.
Well, I know I'd hate to say should, because that would put some heifer growers out of business that are doing a good job.
We're not talking bad about those guys.
Yeah. I know we had this at our university dairy. We had some of these discussions as well, because we actually send our heifers to a grower now. And it was really hard for me personally to accept, because I like the idea, we're a teaching institution, and kind of like you don't want to offload your kids, you don't want to offload your heifers, and so it was kind of hard for me to accept that, because I wanted to do it right. I wanted to have it there for our students to be able to observe and to see, and it just got to a point where it just wasn't feasible for us. That was mostly a windstorm that knocked over one of the heifer barns, but
I think some of it becomes you end up with a bottleneck somewhere, right? You have a land base or whatever, and I think this is what's driven a lot of ag is, we're going to specialize in one thing and take the resources we have and be really, really good at milking cows, right?
Yeah.
And multi-site operations is even like, we're just going to calve on one site for that same logic, right? So there's downsides, but I think there's some logic to it too.
Yeah. We were kind of having the same conversation in the last podcast. We were talking about beef on dairy, and should you raise your beef calves, right? And so I guess the same is true here is, what's your core competency?
Yeah.
And, I guess the next question, I think I know the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. So do you raise your heifers? If you got some facilities, you raise your heifers, you raise your beef calves.
We actually have a lot of producers that are doing that. We just did a survey of our dairy producers in Iowa, and we found the two most common options were selling them at birth or finishing them out. There's not a whole lot of people doing the in-between. And mostly it was almost 60% of them said they're just selling them at birth, at least of the people who responded to our survey. But if you have facilities and knowledge, finishing out steers and raising milking cows are not the same. If you can utilize your knowledge and your resources, I know if I'm using Iowa as an example, we have a lot of great resources about beef development and the beef industry. And so if you have those resources available to you, and again, going back to this whole idea of core competencies, what you can do well, it can make a lot of sense. So, but it's also hard to, if you can get $800 or $1,000 a pop for a wet calf, it's hard to turn that down too.
It really is. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm kind of wondering. I'm formulating a question here now.
I got
Bill,
one.
yeah, go for it.
You talk a bit about more than a bit, but age at first calving. Is a good mean better than, you can have a good mean with huge variation?
That is something I'm going to talk about. Yeah.
Okay, so can you give us a prelude?
You need both. Yeah, you need both good mean and good variation. It's like you watched my talk already. You need good
I did read your papers.
Yeah, that's fair. So you need to get that average right, but also we want to reduce the variation we have around that average. And we have found, again, this is anecdotal, but with the herds, some of the herds we've worked with, a lot of that comes back to reducing that variation in the age that they're being bred. And so making sure that we're breeding them close to around the same time. That can come from, so I want to caveat that though, we should be breeding them on age and size. So if you have a heifer that's not grown enough yet, or if you want to wait a cycle or two to make sure that she's more mature, more likely to be successful, that can be done if you have some smaller heifers that you want to get a little bit more growth out of in the short term, right? So if you're making a decision, you have heifers in front of you today that you're deciding whether or not to breed, they have to have met, the age, but they also need to have met the size. If you're finding that you have consistently a lot of variation and not all heifers are reaching the size that you want at the right age, then it's time to have that conversation with your nutritionist and maybe even your veterinarian too, to go back and say, okay, what is causing this variation? Is it health issues pre-calving? Are we getting a lot of those like poor doers because they're not thrifty? Is it a nutrition issue? Is it an overstocking issue? Is it there's a whole bunch of things that could lead into that. But yeah, in the short term, when you have the heifers in front of you that you're trying to make that decision today, it's age and size.
What kind of, is there the best producers, what kind of variation would they see in age at first calving?
Ooh, I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. You know what it's not when you see it. Okay. So probably within a month on either side of that, and you see a nice little, normal distribution. But probably within a month of your mean would be good. So.
Got a heifer shortage going on right now. Do you see people changing their practices to try to rush these heifers into production? And then is there anything that we should do differently because we got a heifer shortage?
We see a lot of people wondering what to do as a result of their heifer shortage. And I think I don't know if I've worked with a bunch of people who are rushing. I don't think I've seen too much of that, and I'd be curious, Alex, if your experience lines up with that as well. But the breeding decisions are certainly something that people are thinking a lot about right now, and conversations that we're having that we don't want to short your future, but certainly we want people to be able to take advantage of the market prices that we have at the moment. And so we've been kind of coaching people like, okay, we can tighten this up potentially. Usually we try to hold a heifer surplus, and maybe we reduce that surplus a little bit, and we're not pushing for quite as much of a surplus as we were before, but still not getting to the point like, don't expect the world to suddenly be perfect in that heifer rearing, right? That you're, making exactly the right number of heifers that you need, and expect you to not have issues with culling or mortality or morbidity and not having any problems at all. That doesn't really happen overnight. So.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been a breeding changes for sure on farms, utilizing more sex semen versus beef if you're growing herd or you don't have enough heifers. I have seen a lot of guys that are overproducing heifers start to cabbage on to the potential profits of selling some of those extra heifers, but eventually that's going to end at some point too, I think. But I haven't seen a whole lot of guys start to jump on the bandwagon of purposely producing heifers to make a profit out of it, and I think that's not happening for two reasons. Number one, that's a long-term gamble, right? We're talking 2 years versus the beef side, 13 to 14 months if you would go that route. The other aspect is because of how feed prices change, the ebbs and flows in the market, not really having a really good projection of how much it's going to cost you to raise that heifer to term, I think has held back some of those producers trying to find that as like a niche market. But it may come. It may come.
Yeah. A related topic, I've heard tell that there's some people out there thinking about milking some of those beef cross heifers. Have you guys heard of that or seen that happening?
Not on my farms.
Not really, no. I've heard of some accidental beef crosses that they end up in the milking stream, but I don't think there's a lot of intentionality around that. Yeah,
just rumors, I guess. Then.
Alex is like, I wouldn't admit it if I saw that.
Yeah, I don't want those cows to bring down my averages.
When there's wet calves on the ground, it's hard to tell the difference between a beef cross and a Jersey cross.
Yeah.
So, I think sometimes they might accidentally find their way up there, we've had some people question maybe going the other way and saying, should we start producing beef calves from dairy crosses, like for the beef stream? But I'm not seeing a whole lot of uptake on. It's mostly just questions, right?
Yeah.
Questions and rumors, and not seeing a whole lot of actual uptake on any of that. So
yeah, all right, interesting. Any other key points from your presentation that we need to cover?
I don't think so. I think the main point that I want to drive home is that we want to pay attention to our heifers. We really put a lot of emphasis on that pre-weaning phase when it comes to calves, and we put a lot of emphasis on what we do with them once they calve back in. But we have to make sure that we're raising heifers well in between weaning and that calving too.
Yep. Well, that's a nice wrap up. I think I'll ask the other three gentlemen as well to provide their final comments. Barry, do you got any things you want to wrap up here?
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by NitroSure Precision Release Nitrogen. NitroSure delivers a complete TMR for the rumen microbiome, helping you feed the microbes that feed your cows. To learn more about maximizing microbial protein output while reducing your carbon footprint, visit balchem.com/NitroSure.
Well, I think just focusing on age at first calving and then sort of back calculating from there, how do we need to manage this whole process, including, I think one of the biggest things that I've been surprised how many farms lack is just, do you have good enough records to at least know the death rate annually on your calves? Because if you don't know that, you don't know how many heifers you need to produce. And for another thing, you should just be keeping records that you can go back and analyze to try to solve that problem, right? So that's a good starting point for a lot of farms.
Perfect. Alex, you have any practical advice for us?
Yeah, I would echo those comments, but also the push to have better heifer record numbers that, as you are a team approach on these dairies and you're trying to make decisions, you have things that you're collecting to make decisions in, because as we know, you can't manage what we don't measure. So I think that's critical. And as we continue to ride more lean heifer numbers, that becomes even more critical, that every single heifer that we're having enter the herd is the right size and bred at the right time to optimize her milk production for the next several years.
Yeah, excellent. Bill, any words of wisdom?
No, but I'll say something. I think what you kept saying is this is an investment, and that to me we always looked at it as a cost, and it's you kept emphasizing investment, which means sometimes spending money is worth it. And I think that's a very important concept to keep bringing on these what I call non-productive, non-income earning units.
Yep.
Bill, you sell yourself short. That was an excellent summary. Thank you. All right, folks, this has been a fun one. Appreciate you guys spending some time with us here. To our loyal audience, as always, thank you for joining us here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.